Have you ever felt that inexplicable loneliness that creeps into your soul, even when surrounded by people, as if something essential was missing, as if the companionship you truly seek remains elusive, despite all the faces that surround you daily? That feeling that gnaws at your heart in the quiet hours of the night, whispering that perhaps you are walking this path alone, even as countless footsteps echo alongside yours on life's journey. I remember meeting a woman by the shores of a vast lake, her eyes reflecting both the expansive water and a profound emptiness within. When we spoke about the companions of her life, she told me something that has remained etched in my consciousness. I've collected 1,000 friends throughout my years, yet I've never felt truly seen by any of them. Her words carried the weight of a universal human longing, one that perhaps you too have felt in those moments when conversation runs shallow and connections feel superficial. This longing to know who truly walks beside us, to recognize our authentic companions on this spiritual journey, is what Walt Whitman addressed with such penetrating insight in his poetry and life philosophy. Today, I will share with you Whitman's profound understanding of true companionship, not the superficial kind that modern society often mistakes for genuine connection, but the deep, soul-stirring awareness of who really journeys with us through this mysterious existence. This awareness has the power to transform your perception so completely that you will never again feel the ache of essential loneliness, even in your most solitary moment. The secret that Whitman discovered about who really walks beside you isn't found in social gatherings or digital connections, but in the intimate recognition of the divine presence that permeates every fiber of existence, every atom of your being, and every soul you encounter. This recognition, once it blossoms within you, will forever change how you perceive yourself and others. Whitman didn't arrive at this understanding through abstract theology or complicated spiritual practices. His revelation came through the simple yet profound art of presence, through fully inhabiting each moment with all his senses alive and his awareness expanded. Walking along the bustling streets of Manhattan one ordinary afternoon, Whitman experienced a moment of extraordinary clarity. As he observed the diverse faces passing by, he suddenly perceived not merely separate individuals, but a magnificent procession of the divine in countless forms. Each person walking past him was not just a stranger, but a manifestation of the same cosmic energy that flowed through his own veins. In that moment he realized he had never truly been alone, and neither had anyone else, though most remained unaware of the sacred companionship that had been with them since their first breath. This is the practice I wish to share with you today. The simple yet transformative awareness that Whitman cultivated, which allowed him to see who truly walks beside not only him, but every human being. It begins with a shift in perception, so fundamental yet so overlooked, that most people live their entire lives without experiencing it, even though it remains available to us in every moment. The practice itself is deceptively simple, yet its effects ripple through every aspect of existence, dissolving the illusion of separation that causes so much of our suffering. It involves nothing more complicated than learning to see with what Whitman called the soul's eyes, perceiving beyond the physical form to the divine essence that animates all life. This perception isn't some mystical ability reserved for poets and prophets, but our natural birthright, covered over by layers of conditioning that teach us to see difference and separation, where unity and connection are the deeper reality. Whitman wrote, "I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars." This seemingly simple observation contains the essence of his spiritual insight, one that can transform your understanding of who walks beside you at this very moment. Just as he saw divinity in a humble blade of grass, he recognized the same sacred presence in every human being, including himself, not as an abstract concept but as a living reality to be experienced directly. I want to pause for a moment and invite you into a personal reflection that touches the heart of this Whitmanian perception. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to feel, not think about, the question I'm about to ask you. In what moments of your life have you sensed a mysterious presence walking beside you, a companion beyond the visible? Even if you couldn't name or fully understand what or who it was, this feeling of being accompanied by something greater than yourself, something that sees you completely, is not imagination, but a glimpse of the reality that Whitman lived within constantly. I know that perhaps you've never shared this sensation with anyone because How could words capture something so intimate and ineffable? But here, in this space we're creating together, your experience is fully honored and understood. If something in you feels called to share your journey with this sense of presence, the comments below are a sacred space for your voice. You might consider completing this thought. My experience with sensing who truly walks beside me taught me that, Maitani, your sincere reflection may illuminate the path for many other seekers who have felt the same presence but lacked the words to express it. Or if you prefer to contemplate this question in the silence of your heart, that too is a profound way to honor your unique spiritual journey. The recognition of who truly walks beside us manifests in different ways for different souls. For some, this companion appears as a sense of guidance that emerges in moments of stillness, a knowing that transcends rational thought. For others, it reveals itself as an overwhelming feeling of being loved and accepted beyond any human capacity for love. Still others perceive it as a mysterious intelligence that orchestrates synchronicities and meaningful coincidences, evidence of a consciousness far greater than our own, that participates intimately in our lives. Some feel it most strongly in nature, where the artificial boundaries between self and world dissolve more easily. Standing before the vast ocean or beneath the canopy of ancient trees, they sense unmistakably that they are not separate observers of nature, but integral expressions of the same life force that powers the tides and lifts the branches towards sunlight. For Whitman, this presence was not something to be worshipped from afar, but embraced as our most intimate reality. He understood that the divine doesn't walk beside us as a separate entity, but expresses itself as us and through us. This is why he could write with such conviction, "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you." In these words lies a revolution in spiritual understanding, one that collapses the perceived distance between humanity and divinity, between self and other. Yet for all the simplicity and accessibility of this awareness, there are significant obstacles that prevent most people from maintaining this perception of who truly accompanies them through life. Perhaps the most formidable barrier is our cultural conditioning toward individualism and separation, a worldview that defines identity primarily through difference rather than commonality. From early childhood, most of us are taught to see ourselves as isolated entities, competing for limited resources in a world of separate objects rather than as expressions of a unified field of consciousness. The noise and pace of modern life further complicate our ability to sense this ever-present companionship. Constant stimulation from digital devices, the demands of productivity, and the incessant chatter of an anxious mind create a veil of distraction that obscures our awareness of deeper realities. When attention is perpetually fragmented, the subtle presence that Whitman perceived so clearly becomes nearly impossible to notice, though it never actually leaves us. Fear, too, plays a powerful role in separating us from the awareness of who walks beside us. The ego, constructed to help us navigate the physical world, often perceives surrender to a larger reality as a kind of death. It resists the dissolution of boundaries that would allow us to experience our connection to the divine ground of being, preferring the familiar discomfort of isolation to the unknown territory of cosmic belonging. Social pressure to appear self-sufficient and independent can also make us reluctant to acknowledge our longing for and experience of divine companionship. In a culture that often equates spirituality with superstition or weakness, many people keep their deepest intuitions private, doubting their own experiences when they cannot be verified by the limited methodologies of materialist science. The path toward recognizing who truly walks beside you begins with creating space for this awareness to emerge naturally. Whitman understood that this recognition cannot be forced through rigid practices or intellectual striving, but arises spontaneously when we allow ourselves to be fully present to life as it unfolds moment by moment. His approach was one of receptivity rather than acquisition, of opening rather than grasping. The transformation Whitman describes happens through a process of remembering rather than learning something new. It involves peeling away the layers of forgetting that have accumulated through years of living in a culture that systematically ignores the sacred dimension of existence. This remembering occurs most readily in moments of full sensory engagement with life, when we temporarily step outside the narrow confines of conceptual thinking and enter the spaciousness of direct experience. Consider how Whitman approached this remembering. He would often engage in what he called loafing, extended periods of seemingly aimless wandering during which he would immerse himself completely in whatever captured his attention. Whether observing workers on the docks, lying in fields of grass, watching clouds drift overhead, or sitting with wounded soldiers during the Civil War, he practiced a quality of attention that was both utterly receptive and deeply reverent. This practice required no special circumstances or elaborate preparation. It happened in the midst of ordinary life, transforming the mundane into the miraculous through nothing more complicated than wholehearted presence. For Whitman, the body played an essential role in this recognition of divine companionship. Unlike spiritual traditions that view physical existence as an obstacle to realization, he understood the body as a sacred vessel through which the infinite expresses itself in finite form. Every sensation, every pleasure and pain, every breath and heartbeat was for him evidence of the divine life coursing through human form. This is why his poetry celebrates the body with such unabashed enthusiasm, not from mere sensuality, but from the profound recognition that divinity doesn't transcend physicality, but expresses itself through it. To practice this Whitmanian awareness in your own life, begin by reclaiming your sensory experience from the tyranny of constant thought. Several times throughout your day, pause to fully inhabit your senses. Feel the texture of the air against your skin, the subtle movements of your breath, the symphony of sounds that surrounds you always. Notice how rarely you give these sensations your full attention and how different the world appears when perceived with your complete presence. As you develop this capacity for presence, gradually expand your awareness to include the life that animates not just your own form, but all forms. When you encounter another person, practice seeing beyond their physical appearance and social role to the mysterious consciousness that peers out through their eyes, the same consciousness that animates your own being. This doesn't require any special effort or technique, just a willingness to look more deeply than habit usually allows. In moments of solitude, which our culture often teaches us to fear or fill with distraction, experiment with the radical notion that you are not actually alone. Sense the vibrant field of intelligence that permeates every atom of existence, the living presence that doesn't walk beside you so much as express itself as you. This presence isn't something you need to imagine or believe in. It is simply what remains when you stop imposing your concepts and expectations on reality. One of the most powerful applications of Whitman's insight is in transforming our relationship with nature. The next time you find yourself outdoors, whether in a manicured park or a wild landscape, approach the experience with the understanding that you are not observing nature from outside but participating in it from within. The trees, the birds, the shifting clouds, and the very ground beneath your feet are not separate objects for your enjoyment or study, but expressions of the same life that constitutes your own being. This shift in perception from observer to participant, from isolation to inclusion, reveals the profound companionship that nature has always offered us. Another context where this awareness can be especially transformative is in our intimate relationships. When we recognize that the same divine presence expresses itself through our loved ones, we stop relating to them as sources of fulfillment for our personal needs and begin to approach them with the reverence they deserve as manifestations of the sacred. This doesn't diminish the unique qualities of each individual, but places those qualities within a larger context of shared divine essence. Perhaps the most challenging yet rewarding domain for practicing this awareness is with those we perceive as difficult, or even as enemies. Whitman's inclusive vision extended to all of humanity, not just those easy to love. When we glimpse the divine presence expressing itself, even through those whose values or behaviors we find objectionable, we begin to understand Jesus' challenging teaching to love our enemy. This doesn't mean condoning harmful actions, but recognizing that beneath the surface, differences lies a common sacred source. There are, however, common pitfalls on this path of recognition that Whitman would caution against. One is the tendency to turn this direct perception into a mere intellectual concept, another idea to think about rather than a reality to be lived. When this happens, the vibrant, transformative power of the insight becomes diluted into something that sounds spiritually impressive, but lacks the force to change how we actually experience our lives. Another error is to use spiritual insights as a form of spiritual bypassing, a way of avoiding the sometimes painful work of being fully human. Whitman never suggested that recognizing our divine nature means transcending our humanity. On the contrary, he insisted that the divine fully embraces and expresses itself through every aspect of human experience, including its shadows and difficulty. A third mistake is to turn this awareness into a source of spiritual pride, a way of seeing oneself as more evolved or enlightened than others who haven't had the same recognition. True understanding of who walks beside us naturally produces humility, not superiority, because it reveals that our individual consciousness is merely one wave in a vast ocean of awareness that expresses itself uniquely through each being. For Whitman, the recognition of divine companionship wasn't an escape from engagement with the world, but the foundation for a more authentic participation in it. His spiritual insight led him not to withdrawal, but to greater involvement in the struggles and celebrations of his time. During the Civil War, he spent years visiting wounded soldiers in military hospitals, offering not just practical help, but the healing presence of someone who truly saw them in all their humanity. This integration of spiritual awareness with compassionate action offers a model for how recognizing who truly walks beside us can transform not just our inner experience, but our contribution to the world. The beauty of Whitman's approach is that it doesn't require us to adopt any particular belief system or religious framework. His was a spirituality of direct experience, available to anyone willing to look beneath the surface appearances of life, to the deeper currents that connect all beings. Whether you identify as religious, spiritual but not religious, agnostic, or even atheist, the experience of profound connection that Whitman described remains accessible, not as a matter of faith, but as a direct perception of what is already present. In essence, what Whitman offers us is a way of recognizing that the companion we have been seeking outside ourselves has been with us all along, not as a separate entity that walks beside us, but as the very ground of our being, the source from which we and all things continuously arise. This recognition dissolves the sense of fundamental loneliness that plagues so many in our time, revealing it to be based on a misperception rather than a reality. The practice of seeing who truly walks beside you ultimately reveals that there is no beside at all, no separation between you and the divine presence you seek. As Whitman put it, "I am large, I contain multitudes." This isn't poetic exaggeration, but a straightforward description of what he experienced through his practice of presence, the discovery that what we call the self is not a small, isolated entity, but a vast field of consciousness temporarily expressing itself through an individual form. This unification of the human and divine, of self and other, of the finite and infinite, is not just Whitman's vision, but the perennial insight at the heart of all authentic spirituality, expressed through countless traditions in different languages and metaphors, but pointing always to the same direct experience of our true nature. What makes Whitman's approach particularly valuable for our time is its radical inclusivity and its refusal to separate the spiritual from the material. Unlike spiritual paths that require withdrawal from ordinary life or rejection of bodily existence, his way embraces everything as an expression of the divine, from the most sublime experiences to the most mundane. This allows us to practice awareness of who truly walks beside us, not just during meditation or in sacred spaces, but in every context and circumstance of our lives. Consider for a moment what it would mean to move through your day with the continuous awareness that you are never alone, that the divine presence is not something distant or separate from your experience, but the very substance of it. How would you treat yourself differently if you recognized the sacred nature of your own being? How would your interactions with others transform if you perceived the same divine presence looking out through their eyes? How would your relationship with the natural world shift if you experienced it as a living expression of the same consciousness that animates you? These are not merely philosophical questions, but invitations to a different way of being in the world, one that Whitman not only described but embodied throughout his life. His poetry wasn't just art, but testimony to a way of seeing that is available to all of us. The practice that reveals who truly walks beside you requires no special talent or spiritual advancement, only a willingness to question your fundamental assumptions about who you are and what the world is. It begins with simple attention to your direct experience. Before interpretation and conceptualization create the illusion of separation between observer and observe. As you continue to develop this capacity for presence, you may notice subtle shifts in your perception. Colors might appear more vivid, sounds more distinct, sensations more immediate. These aren't mere psychological effects but indications that you are beginning to perceive reality less through the filter of conceptual thought and more through direct awareness. This is the doorway through which Whitman entered his expanded perception of existence, where the boundaries between self and other, human and divine, began to dissolve. Another sign that you're beginning to recognize who truly walks beside you is a spontaneous sense of gratitude and wonder that arises not in response to anything in particular, but simply from being alive. Whitman described this as happiness, which is the feeling through the whole frame that existence in itself, bare and strange as it is, with nothing but empty space and wharves and sea around, is happiness enough. Chateau, this contentment without cause is the natural state of a consciousness that recognizes its connection to the divine ground of being. You might also notice a decreasing attachment to the narratives of lack and longing that previously drove your search for fulfillment outside yourself. As you begin to sense the fullness of the presence that has always been with you, the desperate need to find completion through external acquisition or achievement gradually subsides. This doesn't mean losing motivation or purpose, but finding a more authentic source for action in the natural expression of who you already are, rather than in the attempt to become something you imagine you should be. For some, the recognition of who walks beside them comes as a sudden awakening, a dramatic shift in perception that permanently alters their sense of reality. For others, and perhaps for most, it unfolds gradually through countless small moments of presence and recognition, each one dissolving a little more of the illusion of separation, until one day they realize that something fundamental has changed in how they experience themselves and the world. Whitman himself described both kinds of experiences in his work, suggesting that the path to recognition isn't linear but unique to each individual. What matters isn't the form your awakening takes, but the quality of awareness you bring to each moment of your life, the willingness to see beyond appearances to the deeper reality that Whitman perceived so clearly. As this awareness deepens, you may find that the question itself begins to transform. Instead of asking who walks beside you, you might begin to wonder who or what you really are, beyond the limited identity constructed by thought and memory. This inquiry leads to the heart of Whitman's spiritual vision, the recognition that what we call the self is not separate from the divine presence we seek, but an expression of it, a unique manifestation of the infinite in finite form. This understanding doesn't diminish our individuality, but places it within a larger context, revealing our personal existence as a precious and irreplaceable note in the cosmic symphony, rather than an isolated fragment in an indifferent universe. As Whitman wrote, "I pass death with the dying, and birth with the new washed babe, and am not contained between my hat and boots." This expansion of identity beyond the boundaries of the separate self is the essence of the spiritual liberation he experienced and pointed to in his work. One of the most profound effects of recognizing who truly walks beside you is the dissolution of the fear of death that haunts so much of human existence. When we identify solely with our physical form and personal history, death appears as the ultimate threat, the final erasure of everything we believe ourselves to be. But when we begin to experience ourselves as expressions of an eternal presence that manifests through countless forms without ever being contained by any of them, death is revealed as a transformation rather than an end, a change of form rather than a cessation of being. Whitman expressed this fearlessness toward death throughout his work, not as a philosophical position, but as the natural consequence of his direct perception of reality. "And as to you, death," he wrote, "and you bitter hug of mortality, it is idle to try to alarm me." This wasn't bravado, but the natural confidence of someone who had recognized that his essential nature transcended the boundaries of birth and death. Another gift of this recognition is a profound sense of belonging in the universe, not as a privilege granted by some external authority, but as your birthright, your natural state. The loneliness and alienation that characterize so much of modern existence are revealed as symptoms of a mistaken identity, the belief that you are separate from the whole of life, rather than an integral expression of it. As this misperception dissolves, so too does the sense of fundamental isolation that drives so much of human suffering. You begin to feel at home not just in certain places or with certain people, but wherever you are, because you recognize that the presence you once sought outside yourself is your very essence, inseparable from your being. The question of who walks beside you ultimately leads beyond companionship to communion, beyond the perception of divine presence as something other than yourself, to the recognition of your inseparability from it. This is the culmination of Whitman's spiritual journey, the realization he expressed when he wrote, "I am the mate and companion of people, all just as immortal and fathomless as myself." In these words, he wasn't claiming special status, but pointing to the universal truth of our shared divine nature, hidden from many but available to all who are willing to look beyond the surface of appearances to the deeper reality that sustains them. As we near the end of our exploration, I want to address a question that may have arisen in your mind. If this divine presence is always with us, why do we need to discover it at all? Why isn't it immediately obvious to everyone? The answer lies in the nature of consciousness itself, and in how our attention becomes conditioned from early childhood to focus on the separate objects of experience rather than on the awareness in which they appear. This conditioning is so pervasive and begins so early that we come to mistake our conceptual maps of reality for reality itself, overlooking the living presence that animates our experience in favor of the mental constructs we use to interpret it. Whitman's genius was in finding a way back to direct perception, a way of seeing the world not through the filter of acquired concepts, but through what he called the simple eye, which perceives reality as it is before the mind divides it into separate objects and events. This way of seeing doesn't require years of spiritual practice or adherence to complex belief systems. It's available in any moment when we're willing to set aside our habitual patterns of thinking and perceiving to encounter life directly, with the innocent attention of a consciousness that isn't seeking anything but simply present to what is. This practice of presence, of fully inhabiting each moment with all our senses and faculties, alive and receptive, is the "this" in our title, the simple yet profound act that reveals who truly walks beside us. It's not something we need to add to our lives, but something we need to stop overlooking. The ever-present companion that has been with us from the beginning, closer than our own breath, yet often unrecognized amid the noise and distraction of modern existence. If this exploration has resonated with something deep within you, if you've glimpsed even momentarily the truth of who walks beside you through all the moments of your life, I invite you not only to continue this practice of presence, but to share your journey with our community. By subscribing to this channel, you'll join a circle of fellow seekers who are exploring Whitman's vision, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a living reality to be experienced and embodied in daily life. If this video has offered you a new perspective on companionship, or a deeper understanding of your own experience of presence, please give it a like to help others find this message, and consider sharing it with someone who might be feeling that sense of essential loneliness that comes from not recognizing the divine companion that has been with them all along. I believe deeply in the transformative power of Whitman's insight, not as a dogma to be accepted, but as an invitation to direct experience. I've dedicated years to exploring and living these teachings, not as an expert, but as a fellow traveler continually amazed by the depths they continue to reveal. This channel is my way of sharing that journey with you and creating a space where we can explore together the mysteries of existence that Whitman pointed to with such clarity and passion. One of the most beautiful aspects of Whitman's vision is that it doesn't require us to reject or transcend our humanity, but rather to embrace it more fully, recognizing the divine not as something separate from our everyday experience, but as its very essence. This integration of the sacred and the ordinary, the spiritual and the material, offers a path that is both profoundly transformative and entirely accessible, requiring no special circumstances or conditions beyond the willingness to be fully present to what is. In this respect, Whitman stands in stark contrast to spiritual traditions that emphasize withdrawal from the world or the denial of bodily existence. His was a spirituality of engagement rather than escape, of celebration rather than renunciation. He saw the divine not as something to be sought in some distant realm, but as the living reality that animates every aspect of existence, from the most sublime to the most mundane. This perspective is particularly relevant in our time, when so many people feel torn between the materialistic values of modern culture and a longing for deeper meaning and connection. Whitman offers a way forward that doesn't require us to choose between these seemingly opposing tendencies, but rather to recognize them as different expressions of the same underlying reality. His vision allows us to fully embrace our humanity, while simultaneously recognizing its divine ground, to enjoy the pleasures of embodied existence while perceiving the sacred dimension that permeates it. This integration of apparent opposites lies at the heart of Whitman's spiritual genius and offers a model for how we might heal the fragmentation that characterizes so much of contemporary life. I want to share with you a practice that Whitman himself used to cultivate this awareness of who walks beside us. It's a simple exercise that you can integrate into your daily life, requiring nothing more than a few moments of intentional attention. Begin by choosing an ordinary activity that you perform regularly, something as mundane as washing dishes, walking to your car, or waiting in line at a store. The next time you engage in this activity, make a conscious decision to be fully present to it with all your senses. Feel the temperature and texture of the water on your hands. Notice the play of light on the soap bubbles. Hear the subtle sounds of dishes touching. Or feel the rhythm of your footsteps, the movement of air against your skin as you walk, the shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground before you. The specific activity doesn't matter. What's essential is bringing your complete attention to it without dividing yourself into an observer separate from what's being observed. As you maintain this quality of presence, you may begin to notice a curious shift. The boundary between you and the activity starts to become less solid, less absolute. There arises a sense of wholeness in which the traditional subject-object relationship dissolves into a unified field of experience. This is not a conceptual understanding but a direct perception, a taste of the non-dual awareness that Whitman inhabited so naturally. "What I shall assume, you shall assume," he wrote, pointing to this essential inseparability of all things, this common ground of being that transcends, yet includes our individual expressions. This simple practice, repeated regularly, gradually erodes the habitual perception of ourselves as isolated entities moving through a world of separate objects. It opens us to the direct experience of what Whitman called the vast similitude that interlocks all, the divine presence that doesn't merely walk beside us, but constitutes our very existence and the existence of all things. Whitman's approach to spiritual awakening was radically democratic, refusing the hierarchical models that place enlightenment at the end of a long, arduous path accessible only to the few who can dedicate their lives to spiritual practice. He insisted that the divine is not hidden in some remote, transcendent realm, but immediately present in the ordinary world we inhabit daily, available to anyone willing to see with the soul's eyes, rather than merely the physical eyes conditioned by cultural assumptions about reality. "The messages of the great poets to each man and woman," he wrote, "are come and find me. Not go and seek me in some distant place or future state, but find me here and now, in this moment, in this body, in this world with all its beauty and pain, its light and shadow." This is perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Whitman's spiritual vision. This insistence on the accessibility of divine presence not as a reward for spiritual achievement, but as our natural state, our birthright, requiring only that we drop the veils of conditioning that obscure our direct perception of reality. The practice of recognizing who walks beside you is not about attaining some special state or acquiring spiritual knowledge, but about remembering what you've always known at the deepest level of your being, beneath the noise of cultural conditioning and personal history. It's about recovering a way of seeing that was natural to us as children before we learned to divide the world into separate objects and ourselves into separate selves. "There was a child went forth every day," Whitman wrote, "and the first object he looked upon, that object he became." This is not poetic fancy, but a description of consciousness before it's trained to maintain rigid boundaries between self and world, observer and observed. The child doesn't yet experience himself as separate from what he perceives. There's simply perception occurring within an undivided field of awareness. This is the state to which Whitman invites us to return, not by regressing to childhood,